Greetings to all Asia Undercurrent viewers. I'm Koichiro Matsumoto, Deputy Cabinet Secretary for Public Affairs of the Prime Minister's Office of Japan. Thank you for joining us for the sixth session of the Asia Undercurrent series. When we launched this webinar in June last year, we had one core mission, giving a precise diagnosis on what comes next in Asia through exciting discussions amongst world-class experts. To this end, we have brought on board prominent panelists from around the world, such as Dr. Micah Green of CSIS and Professor Nobukatsu Kanehara of Doshisha University, both of whom appeared in this webinar twice already, to take stock of the geopolitical and economic reality in Asia and the wider Indo-Pacific. I'm proud to inform you that our past 5 sessions have won very positive responses from the viewers, as our video footages have been viewed thousands of times with viewers from over 70 countries across 6 continents. As a producer of this webinar, I would like to sincerely thank all the viewers for your continued and passionate support, which were the driving forces in making this project a success. I would also like to announce that thanks to the great feedback from you, the planning for a second season of this webinar is well underway, and I hope to welcome you again in May with a new lineup, which is both entertaining and useful to the policymakers, intellectuals, executives, and business people like yourselves. Currents in Asia, as well as those of Indo-Pacific, are getting faster than ever, and the waters are somewhat muddied. The region now stands at a crossroad of whether or not it will embrace a free and open rule-based order in order to maintain its growth trajectory. I hope that this Asia Undercurrent webinar series will continue to help satisfy your intellectual curiosity in an attempt to navigate through these currents of both challenges and opportunities. So with that, I wish to give the floor to today's moderator, Mr. Robert Feldman. Robert, the floor is yours. And thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Matsumoto-san, and thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I'm looking forward to a very lively session. First, let me give a very brief introduction of the panelists, and then talk a little bit about what we're talking about tonight and how we'll structure the session. Our panelists, we're very delighted to have 3 distinguished panelists. Aiko Lane, who is Executive Director of the U.S.-Japan Business Council at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Ken Shibusawa, who is the President of Shibusawa and Company. And Noah Sneider, who is the Tokyo Bureau Chief for The Economist. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. On the structure of the webinar, I'm going to start off myself with just a little brief introduction about the new form of capitalism, talk a little bit about what the structure is, particularly the essay that Prime Minister Kishida put into Bunge Shinju a while back. And then we'll go into statements from each of the panelists, about 6 minutes each, on their approach and the things they think are important about it. Then we'll have about 30 minutes worth of discussion, and I've got some, I hope, pointed questions for our panelists to bring out some of the details, what we do, what we don't know. Then we'll have about 15 minutes or more of questions and answers from the audience. With that, in that respect, please see the little question, or put the questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Then we'll have a brief summary and a wrap up, and then finish around 75 minutes into it. Let me also add that our co-hosts for tonight are the government of Japan and the Nikkei, and so thank you for the sponsorship for this, this wonderful session. So let me get started. When the term new form of capitalism comes up in the newspapers, on TV, almost universally, the reaction is anywhere from skeptical to negative. I keep hearing questions such as, oh, isn't Kishida rejecting Abenomics? Isn't it just slogans and speeches? Where's the foreign policy? Where's the Indo-Pacific? Isn't this just a smokescreen for redistribution policy? Growth strategy is vague. Isn't economic security just going to be an excuse for more regulation, more protectionism? And isn't it market hostile? So, where do we see market friendliness here? Those are the kind of reactions you're getting from people. In contrast, I'm much more positive, largely on the basis of the essay that Prime Minister Kishida put in Bunge Shinju a couple of weeks ago. Let me summarize his points there. First of all, he starts off by saying the purpose of this new capitalism is to show that capitalism plus democracy is a better system than authoritarianism plus state capitalism. Okay, so that's the purpose of this. Okay. Second point, in a global economy, there are more and larger negative externalities like climate change that we have to deal with together. At home, Japan has a labor force that's dropping faster than the population, and therefore productivity growth has to accelerate quite sharply just to maintain even a modest growth of standard of living. Okay? Faster productivity requires major investments, particularly he emphasizes in human capital, but also in infrastructure and intellectual capital. Moreover, we need faster diffusion of all this new technology. There is where things start to get difficult because faster diffusion always creates economic and social tensions between the people who based on the current system and the people who need a new system. Therefore, he says we have to work together in a new way to balance these various interests. So that's the way he's presenting this new form of capitalism right now. Okay, so to summarize, it starts with technology, moves to the three types of investments, and then uses the benefits of productivity increase to raise wages. Okay, that's the theory, which brings up Yogi Berra, okay, the American baseball player who said that the difference between theory and practice is that in theory and practice are the same, but in practice, they're not. That's why we have these three experts with us tonight who are going to tell us not what's wrong with it, but how do we get from theory to practice? So if I may, let me start out arguing for the affirmative with Ken Shibusawa, a good friend who is also a member of Prime Minister Kishida's committee on the new capitalism. Ken, can you give us about 6 minutes of your views on what's going on?
Great. Thank you so much, Robbie. Thank you, everybody, for joining our webinar today. New form of capitalism. Let me start with the why question. Why is new capitalism ready, timely at this point? In Japan, there is, as we know, there's a huge demographic shift in Japan. Back in what we call the Showa period, the Made in Japan period, the Japan as #1 period, we had a demographic pyramid. Then we went through the Heisei period, and where we had this double barrel bulge, and we spent 30 years of that. And now we're in the Reiwa period, and we're going to a negative backwards pyramid very, very quickly. And so we're at this very, very interesting point where Japanese society is really in a big paradigm shift. And with that, the world, what's the world like? Well, COVID, that was a big impact on all of our lives. You talked about externalities, Robbie. Externalities was always around, but we never saw it until we had technology in our palms, right? It's visual. Everything's visual. The environmental impact, the social impact. And so I think I'm going to the what question. What is the new form of capitalism? The markets, the media, they like simple answers. They like one simple bylines. But the reality is, what the new form of capitalism is trying to do is trying to integrate those externalities into the market and competition. So it's not, there's a messaging problem because I think that the markets think it's unfriendly to competition. But to me, what the new form of capitalism is trying to achieve is a new measurement for performance of market and competition, which will integrate those externalities that we were talking about. So in the past, we just looked at the financial measurement of performance, and now we're looking for other forms of measurement. And one form of measurement is, important part of it is the human capital. Unless you have the human capital, we can't have this growth and distribution cycle. So we need that human capital portion. I think the new form of capitalism has a messaging problem. There needs to be some word that kind of catches people's imagination, and hopefully we can come up with it during this webinar. For me, I think it's capitalism that cares. It cares about the shareholders because obviously shareholders are the engines of growth, but it also cares about the environment. It also cares about the society, especially the human capital. And that's what the new form of capitalism, I think, is trying to achieve. The how question, well, I think we'll get into that in more detail with your questions. But I think let me repeat that the new form of capitalism is trying to integrate these new externalities that's been basically ignored by the markets, by competition, because it was easier, it was cleaner that way. But I think we're in a world where we need to have measurement for performance for those externalities. And hopefully we can message it in the right way so the markets and the competition figure that it's not unfriendly, but it's an engine for further new growth, sustainable growth. Yeah, you're the moderator, you're on mute.
Thank you. Gomennasai. Thanks for letting me know. So that's the affirmative argument. Let's move now to a journalistic perspective and ask Noah Sneider, who wrote that just magisterial piece on Japan in the December Economist. One of the lines in there that struck me as just very insightful was that Prime Minister Kishida presents himself as a guy who listens, but what Japan needs today is vision. So it's not about the ears, it's about the eyes. So Noah, can you give us your perspective on what is this new form of capitalism, where you think it might go?
Thank you, Robbie, for that kind introduction, and thank you all, the organizers, for putting this together, and my fellow panelists for being here. It's an honor to share this virtual stage with you. Is there a vision to this new capitalism? I mean, I think there's certainly a slogan. I'm less convinced that there's a clear vision so far. But I think it's important to kind of step back just for a second and recall the context that this new capitalism has arrived in Japan in. The immediate context, of course, is the pandemic, which continues to shape both the Japanese economy and the global economy. I mean, we've seen just this week the latest GDP figures showing Japan posting, I believe, 1.3% growth on a quarterly basis in the last quarter of last year, as the pandemic was in a lull. Consumption had picked up, but of course, Omicron hit Japan rather late, and the outlook for the beginning of this year is less rosy. So the pandemic continues to determine the sort of course of the economy in the short term. And then there's the longer term context. I mean, the structural context, what can referred to in terms of demographic change, and the condition that the Japanese economy, and in fact many rich world economies, were in heading into the pandemic, the secular stagnation, the low inflation, the low interest rates, the low growth. And I think when you take that demographic, those demographic factors into account, when you look at economic performance when accounting for population dynamics, Japan, especially in the last decade, in the decade from 2010 to 2019, stacks up quite well with its peers in the G7. That decade, of course, coincided largely with the tenure of Abe Shinzo as prime minister. And I think there's certainly an argument to be made that to the extent the economy improved during that period, it had a lot to do with policy changes under the Abenomics framework. That said, of course, there was a lot of unfinished business at the end of Abe's tenure, a lot, especially in the third bucket of structural reform arrows that either didn't get shot or didn't get fully shot. Much more that could be done on boosting productivity, on reforming the labor market, a long list that we can get into in the discussion. Now we're seeing, of course, some divergence between the Japanese economy and other advanced economies coming out of the pandemic, especially in terms of inflation trends. But I think there's still a good chance that while interest rates may rise sharply in the US and in the West, that they may settle ultimately at a relatively low equilibrium, in no small part due to the demographic factors we talked about earlier. I mean, aging populations and their savings and consumption patterns. So that's to say that I think Japan's experience will continue to be very relevant for the rest of the world going forward. There's a good chance for Japan, as Prime Minister Kishida has stated he hopes to do, to really lead in terms of economic thinking as we head out of the pandemic. I think Kishida's new capitalism has some tailwinds that are important to note. In particular, changes that have been bubbling for quite some time, but clearly have accelerated during the pandemic in terms of preferences for the kind of work people, especially talented young people, want to do, the kind of work styles that people are striving for here in Japan, and the palpable increase in interest in startups and entrepreneurship, especially in the last few years. I mean, I was scrolling through several Japanese digital media sites the other day and noticed that they all now have prominent sections on startups, which didn't exist a few years ago. So that's certainly a tailwind. The question, I guess, is whether new capitalism is the right recipe to unlock the potential the untapped potential in the Japanese economy. I think from what we've seen so far, both in the Bungei article that you mentioned, Robbie, and in some of Kishida-san's speeches, there's very little that can be credibly called new. And so I very much agree with Ken that there is a messaging problem. I mean, when you come out and say that you want to start, we want to implement new capitalism, it does seem to promise, at the very least, something fundamentally new. And it also does have this connotation, this slightly, almost revolutionary sounding connotation, that we want to change something about the underlying structure. If you look at whether it's a break with Abenomics, we, at least on the first two arrows, we still see big fiscal stimulus and the BOJ holding relatively firm on monetary policy, on loose monetary policy. The thing that I think, the jitters that you refer to, the skepticism that you refer to, is largely a response to the biggest change, which is rhetorical. And I was struck in that Bungei article that you mentioned, Robbie, that it begins with a long attack on neoliberalism. And I think that's really the question that Kishida's new capitalism raises for me is it comes down to whether you think that Japan's problem is that it reformed too much, that the changes running from the Koizumi era through the Abe eras went too far, that neoliberalism has run amok and inequality has run rampant, and that Japan needs to sort of roll some of this back. Or whether you think that Japan hasn't reformed enough, that the third arrow wasn't fired powerfully enough, that what the Japanese economy really needs is more openness, more dynamism. So I hope we can get into some of those details, but I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks very much. I think you're right to point out that attack on new liberalism at the start of the essay. And I thought it quite interesting that later on in the essay, he said, well, we got a lot of regulations that really aren't helping us, get where we need to go. And so we got to get rid of those and have a different set of regulations to help us out. So there's something of an inconsistency that does need to be played out or to resolved as we get to the final form of this thing. Okay, let's move to Aiko Lane. Aiko, can you give us your perspective on how Japan can grow from a U.S. business perspective? And I think you've got some ideas that didn't show up in the essay.
Sure, thanks, Robert. Yeah, and I also want to thank the Nikkei and the government of Japan for organizing this discussion. This is really timely. I was asked to talk about Japan's economy in the global context, and I love how Noah phrased it as, is this the right recipe? And so I'm going to, help try to put forward a couple of ideas. So it is well known that Japan is currently the world's third largest economy by GDP, but perhaps what is less well known is that by some estimates, Japan will fall to 8th place by 2050, after India, Indonesia, Brazil, Russia, and Mexico, and in addition to China and the United States. So from a US policy perspective, putting my old government hat back on, it is really strategically important that Japan remains an economically strong democratic power, both regionally and globally. There are 3 specific opportunities for Japan's economic growth from where I sit. First is increasing inward foreign direct investment, or FDI. When we talk about trade and investment, Japan is increasingly a global leader on bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. Japan has more than 20 bilateral and multilateral agreements that are in force or signed, most notably CPTPP and RCEP, with 3 more under negotiation. So this is really a clear dramatic shift in Japan's approach to economic integration, and the government should be commended for this. But Japan's record on cross-border investment reveals a distinct imbalance. On the one hand, Japan has outperformed many countries in terms of outward FDI. Japan is the largest foreign investor in the United States, and at 1.8 trillion, Japan's investment abroad is the 3rd highest in the G7. However, the ratio of Japan's outward to inward FDI is 8-to-1, by far the most lopsided ratio among G7, G20, and OECD countries. Japan particularly lags its G7 peers in terms of the volume and value of inward merger and acquisition transactions, or M&A, in which Japanese companies are acquired by foreign buyers. The same does not apply, however, for Japanese acquisitions of foreign companies. Japanese corporations have long been acquirers of US and European companies, as well as major greenfield investors. So Richard Katz of the Carnegie Council has written extensively about Japan's low inward FDI, and based on 2019 data has shown that Japan ranked 196 out of 196 countries in terms of the ratio of inbound FDI to GDP. This is not the position that third largest economy should be in. Japan's market has considerable strengths, as others on this panel have noted, and it boasts a large and sophisticated economy, a highly educated workforce, and a strong science and technology base. So I was pleased to see that last month, Minister Yamagiwa, in charge of economic revitalization, said that Japan will strategically promote foreign direct investment in Japan. But this is not the first time a Japanese government official has made this pledge. However, given Prime Minister Kishida's focus on economic revitalization, I'm hopeful that this will be a top priority, as it could be a powerful catalyst for renewed growth. As Japan attracts more foreign investment, it will stimulate innovation and increased competition, leading to a stronger and more efficient economy. But to attract the kind of investment that boosts innovation and productivity, Japan will have to get the right policies in place to support strong innovation ecosystems. And moreover, Japan's corporate world will have to overcome its longstanding resistance to inbound M&A. Another example of an opportunity Japan can leverage is to bolster its standing as a global financial center. Tokyo continues to fall behind other major cities in the financial center rankings. And according to one index, Tokyo fell from 5th to 9th place between 2017 and 2021. So as financial services firms reconsider their Northeast Asia presence, particularly given recent changes in Hong Kong, Japan has an opportunity to enhance its own competitiveness through a smart and balanced approach to capital markets regulation. The Japanese government recognizes that this is a potential engine for economic growth, but the current strategy to bolster Tokyo's standing is seen by some industry experts as excessively reliant on relatively narrow considerations, such as attracting more offshore asset managers to Japan and ease of living enhancements for foreigners. So achieving this goal will require a major commitment to bolder, more fundamental initiatives that address the root causes of Japan's relatively anemic financial ecosystem, such as fully modernizing the regulatory system, reforming restrictive labor laws and seniority-based promotion systems, and instead utilizing the full spectrum of employment practices to include hiring, promotions, performance appraisals, and termination. And so finally, I want to touch upon the importance of digitization and Prime Minister Kishida's latest initiatives in this area. Many people have a perception of Japan as being a high-tech country and a leader in computers, microcomponents, and robotics. And in many ways, Japan is. But in some areas, Japan maintains a distinctly low-tech system. an emphasis on digitization has not manifested in improved efficiencies in some key areas. So for example, while COVID has accelerated the use of credit cards and other contactless payment methods, the percentage of purchases via cashless payments is still not on par with China, South Korea, or Southeast Asian countries. So this has broad ripple effects in the rest of the economy and in particular travel and tourism industry. So it's encouraging to see the Japanese government's digital transformation initiative, which includes the new digital agency. But there's a long way to go to provide digital government services and compatible systems across ministries. I'll just call out one study, the Waseda University ranking of 64 countries based on their government's digitization. Japan ranked 9th, down 2 places from 2020. And according to the analysis, Japan's primary issues include a lack of urgency in its digital transformation and an insufficient number of ICT personnel. To promote a digital government, or an insufficient number of ICT personnel to promote a digital government. Japan's labor productivity growth has been slowing for the past several decades and has declined relative to other major economies, such as South Korea. A recent McKinsey report found that more than half of work time in Japan is spent on repetitive activities and suggests that Japan has the most potential to automate jobs by 2030 among major economies. And here's one last metric, one that the Japanese government has focused on and identified, is as a measure of innovation, Japan invests far less in startup firms than other economies in relationship to GDP. Singapore and Israel are at the top in investing the most, and Japan invests much less than China and South Korea. So to correct this, Prime Minister Kishida has as part of his growth strategy, decided to make 2022 the first year to focus on generating startup companies as part of a 5-year plan in the hopes of replicating the post-war period. So digitization will boost productivity, and it's a worthwhile focus area for the Kishida administration. So to sum up, there are a number of areas that in which Japan can boost its economic performance, particularly by encouraging more participation in its economy by foreign investors and innovators. So I look forward to discussing which other policies would be helpful in this regard. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That was great. You pointed out a couple things that I think really bear a lot of emphasis. And one of them is the need for labor law changes to smooth the transition of people from old to new jobs. I think Ken's colleague on the New Capitalism Committee from the Rengo, the big union, I was not expecting particularly forward-looking comments from a large labor organization, but she made some very forward-looking comments, particularly about the need to smooth the transition from old to new jobs. There was a study by the McKinsey Global Institute a couple of years ago. They've redone the numbers. They get basically the same result, that between around 2020 and 2030, Japan will lose something like 16 million jobs in the base case to the new technologies. It will create about 11 million. Okay, so it's a net loss of 5 million jobs, but that happens to be about the same as the reduction of the labor force. So on the surface, it looks like, yeah, things are okay. You're down 5, you lose net 5 jobs. It's okay. It's not okay, because we have to retrain 11 million people. So this issue of retraining people and getting them to move to new jobs, I think, is a very, very critical thing. The financial center issue is also very, very important. I think Ken probably has a few things to say about that too. So if I may, let me start with an issue that has questions to everyone. Start with the issue that Ken raised on the messaging problem. I've had a little idea on that myself. I think we might want to call it triple win capitalism, because it gets across the idea that technology is not a zero-sum game. It's a positive-sum game. And so I wonder if our panelists have any ideas about how to improve the messaging. Ken had an idea for a new name for this. I've just given a little new idea for a new name. Noah, Aiko, do you have any suggestions for how we can get a new name that would get the essence of this across a little better? Maybe Noah?
Well, I'm not sure I'm ready to suggest new slogans for the government of Japan, but I do think it's important that whatever the messaging, whatever the title is, whatever the headline is, it's important that aligns with the content. And I think that gets to something you were saying earlier, Robbie, which is that part of the messaging problem is that new capitalism seems to want to be a little bit of everything. And so it's a bit muddled as a result. It wants to attack neoliberalism, but also attack regulation. It wants to spur growth, but also redistribution. It wants to be business friendly, market friendly, capital friendly, but also labor friendly. So there are a host of contradictions, which I think speak to the tension points inside Japanese society, and maybe it's a reflection of Kishida-san's listening powers, as it were, that he has listened to all sides and included a little bit of everything. So I think the in terms of clarifying the messaging, whatever it may be, a leader does need to make decisions about which side he or she is coming down on any number of these questions. So I think that sort of lack of clarity is something that I hear a lot from folks I talk to, and could certainly be improved.
Okay, very good. Aiko, do you have any suggestions on messaging?
I'll just say that the term capitalism has fallen out of vogue in the US recently. So and I think there's a lot of questions about what exactly new capitalism means, as Noah alluded to. I would say that the concept of new capitalism, has the potential to align with some of the current trends we're seeing in the global economy, namely ESG investing and sustainable capitalism. There certainly is a, delicate balance that needs to be, there needs to be a delicate balance between market mechanisms and a stronger focus on corporate governance and as well as environmental and social objectives. And so Japanese companies should certainly be incentivized to, improve their environmental and social components of their operations, especially if it leads to higher wages and increased productivity. But I think it's really important. I was pleased to hear Shibusawa-san mention that this vision that Prime Minister Kishida has includes shareholder objectives as well, because it's really important to ensure that those are part of the mix. As I think about Japan trying to achieve its goals in terms of net zero 2050, an important part of achieving those objectives is really, comes from the private sector, right? All this clean energy technology and a lot of these advanced technologies, and yet investors will need to be convinced that these short-term upfront costs will have long-term payoff. So, I think it's important to keep that in mind as well. But I agree, there is a bit of there's a little bit of confusion with what exactly new capitalism means, and so it would benefit from a bit better messaging strategy.
Okay, thanks. You've just mentioned this issue of shareholders, and we also have the term stakeholders. In the US, of course, the Business Roundtable a couple of years ago put out their statement about we need to have stakeholder, stuff. Ken, let me ask you, where do you see the New Capitalism Initiative coming out? It's very clearly saying we have to move to stakeholder orientation, which is where the US was 30 years ago and where Japan was for a long time, but have to move more toward or back toward stakeholder. But what is the mix of stakeholders versus shareholders? Whose interests are served? And then there's also a very deep question, which is this. If the boards of directors of companies are chosen by the shareholders, where is the incentive for the board and the management to serve the interest of stakeholders? How does that get done?
Okay, good question. And the messaging part, I want to just kind of jump on that a little bit. And what Aiko was saying, and was also what Noah was saying. there is a lack of clarity, and there is a lack of, like, there are contradictions. And the reason why I said capitalism that cares, when you care, here is a word, but there's a lot of contradiction in care, right? You care about your siblings, you care about your spouses, you care about your, sons and daughters, you care about your friends. And there are always contradictions there. And you don't get to choose this person's better than that person, right? So to me, care is sort of a kind of a big word, simple but big word that that integrates that contradiction. And I agree with Aiko that capitalism is out of vogue. Why? Because capitalism didn't care, didn't care about the environment, didn't care about the society. That was the message that we sent out, especially to the younger generation. And so that's why it's out of vogue. And so to get it back into vogue, I think this notion of caring, it's a very simple human nature, but I think we need to express that in capitalism. Your question on shareholders, a very important question and a very interesting question. For a company, it's a public company, and anybody can invest in that company. Whether you're a short-term guy or a long-term guy, anybody has the freedom to invest, right? I think corporations, they're public companies, so they don't get to choose the shareholders, but they can message it. They can send out messaging saying, this is the kind of shareholders that we think are aligned with our long-term interests of sustainable growth. And for some companies, they changed the what's the constitution of what's the company that what's it called? I'm sorry, I can't think of the English word now. It's the but it's in their document of
articles of incorporation.
I'm sorry, that's the word I was looking for. Articles of incorporation. And if it's in there and says, like for instance, a company called Eisai, and it's right up at the top says, we exist for our patients, and it was approved by the shareholder. And as long as that kind of thing is approved by the shareholder, well, I mean, there's no contradiction there, right? To serve the interest of their primary, what they believe their primary stakeholder. So I think the corporations can be a little bit more creative in terms of the messaging part. Talked about messaging for the new form of capitalism, but also for the corporations to send out, the messaging saying this is the kind of investors that we want to be aligned with, and there'll be unhappy investors, right, with that. But as Noah's saying, you have to choose sides in a sense, right? And you also have to have performance, right? I'm not saying I'm not saying that this is an excuse for not having performance. So, but at the same time, I think a company should have and should be messaging it in a proper way.
Okay, very good. Noah, from your perspective, having looked around a number of countries around the world, as you look at Japanese corporate governance today, do you think it's possible for Japan to absorb some kind of a different set of call it goals, or will it be easier for Japan than for other countries to change the set of goals that they are pursuing?
It's a great question. I mean, I think what's part of what's interesting about this stakeholder capitalism debate in Japan is that in some ways Japan has remained very much a stakeholder oriented system, despite all of the talk of corporate governance reform in the past decade. I mean, there's obviously there's a bifurcation and there are differences when you look at company to company or sector to sector. But in many ways, I would say Japan is still much more stakeholder oriented than certainly than the US. But in other ways, the kind of traditional or post-war version of Japanese stakeholder capitalism hasn't necessarily caught up to incorporating the wider array of stakeholders that exist in the 21st century. The stakeholder capitalism of the 1960s and 70s doesn't doesn't necessarily take into account interest stakeholders, for example, environmental concerns, stakeholders such as non-regular workers. There's a long and growing list of new stakeholders that have emerged. So I think that the kind of question for Japanese corporate governance, in many ways, is if if Japan can figure out a three-win capitalism, a Sampo Yoshi, an Analyx, and an Abacus capitalism that works in this era of much of myriad and complex stakeholders, it would be a real it would be of interest to certainly to the rest of the world, but that's much easier said than done. So it's not just about going back to the old stakeholder capitalism. It has to be about reconceiving what stakeholder capitalism means in these new conditions.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me also remind folks that you can put in questions into the question box. So please do so, and then we can get to some of those questions in the last part of what we're doing. Let me shift gears now, if I may, to what I find one of the most exciting, just thrilling parts of Japan today, and also mentioned quite clearly in the essay on the new capitalism, which is energy. And there's several parts about this. One is that in many places around the world, renewable energy is becoming cheaper than fossil energy. METI here in Japan is getting quite excited about offshore wind, particularly floating offshore wind. There was just a bid for some offshore wind facilities that was won by one consortium at prices that the other consortiums were just incredulous, so low. Okay, so there's a lot going on in that energy sector. So that's part of it. So we'll get lower energy prices. In addition, it will require a great deal of new investment, which is good for the economy. And it will also improve Japan's energy security, which is probably among the weakest of any of the industrial countries. So in terms of energy security, energy investments, what is the role of new capitalism in making things happen? And where do you think the prospects for this are? Let me start, I think, with Aiko, because I think you've had a lot of experience in economic security issues through your career. So could you give us a little bit of your perspective on where energy fits into this?
Sure. Thanks, Robert. So I think that in terms of when we talk about economic security, I think energy security is an important component of this. And one thing that we're closely watching within the US business community is how exactly Japan implements energy transition. I think it's important to note that some countries in the region have made clear they are seeking to dominate the clean energy market. And in particular, China, for instance, has a privileged position, particularly in wind, solar, and batteries, not just due to its scale, but because of its access to critical inputs and massive state support, frankly, compared to other countries in the region. And so as we think about, energy security, I think it's really important for the US and Japan to partner in this regard, and we are already in so many ways. But the US and Japan really need to take an all of the above approach when it comes to energy transition. And, there's, not exactly complete alignment, but I think the US business community is pleased that the Japanese government is including natural gas in this energy transition as an important bridge fuel. One thing that Japan is doing, recently it announced that it has a new Asia Energy Transition Initiative, which provides up to, I think it's about 10 billion in US dollars worth of financing for the full spectrum of energy transition. And I think US companies are hopeful that Japan will use this financing in a way that really enables the US and Japan to partner, particularly when it comes to projects in third countries, and particularly in Southeast Asia.
Very good. Ken, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, I think it's a very important issue. The Prime Minister in the Kabunge Shinzo was mentioning a carbon zero Asia community, and I think that's the part that you picked up, Robbie. And and that got me to thinking a little bit because let's take coal for example. It's a big NG word, right? You can't have coal, right? But if you think about it, that kind was standard, was made in a region of the world that's geographically, in climate-wise, industry-wise, totally different from what Asia is. And for Asia, yeah, coal is not good because it releases carbon dioxide. But I think we kind of missed the point when we say, well, actually, we're going for carbon zero, carbon neutral. So what if you had a system where you recaptured that carbon? They call it CCUS, right? Carbon capture, utilization, and service. And so if you put clean coal technology along with the CCUS technology, and you have a package that says, well, it's carbon neutral, that would fit, I think, the geographic, the climate, the industry, and possibly the cultural aspects of a lot of places in Asia. And so, and that would require lots of financing, obviously. But frankly, Japanese private sector, we're not actually short on capital, short on utilization of that capital. And so I agree with Aiko that there's lots of opportunities for transition finance.
Okay, then the issue becomes which form of energy is actually cheaper. So, for example, there's a firm in New York that puts out levelized cost of electricity estimates for all new projects. And this ignores any pollution impact, et cetera. They're now saying that the price of coal, of electricity based on coal, has gone from 11 cents per kilowatt hour in 2009 to 11 cents per kilowatt hour in 2020. They say that the price per kilowatt hour for solar PV has gone from 36 cents in 2009 to a little bit under 4. Okay, so if you're an Asian country and you're given the choice between coal-based energy, coal-based electricity at 11 cents per kilowatt hour for new facilities and PV-based electricity at 4 cents a kilowatt hour, which would you choose? Now, there are a lot of reasons.
But its price is important, but also the base load.
Yes.
That's an issue, right? So
it is an issue, yeah, and that's where the nuke issue comes in. But anyway, we can talk a little bit about that as well. But let me turn to Noah. Do you have any observations on the energy issue from your excellent reporting?
Look, I think this is another place where we see new capitalism come down somewhere in the middle, and where a bit bolder sense of direction would help. Japan has talked about going carbon neutral by 2050, but when you look at the roadmaps, the basic energy plan that METI released, even just for 2030, there's a big share for nuclear, which few people think is realistic given the current state of operational state of Japan's nuclear plants and the public mood around nuclear energy. So there are some big questions about how Japan itself gets to carbon neutral by 2050 that Kishida's New Capitalism have yet to answer before we get into how Japan might help the rest of Asia get there.
Yes.
So I think that's a place again where there needs to be a bit more clarity.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. If I may, let me turn a little bit to this issue of how much is this going to cost, and then how much, who's going to pay for it. The how much is it going to cost is a completely unknowable issue. One of my students at Tokyo University of Science just did a little calculation that the production of ethylene, okay, he's in the chemical industry. If the cost per kilogram right now for regular, polluting type-based ethylene is about, was it 160 some yen per kilogram? But there is a technology to produce it green. So green ethylene can be produced, but it costs about 540. If we were to introduce a tax and a subsidy scheme, so tax the gray hydrogen, or excuse me, gray ethylene, and subsidize green ethylene, up to the point by 2030 when we would have 1/4 of the ethylene produced by green methods. The net cost over and above the income from the carbon tax, which would be about 50 yen per kilogram, the net cost would be about 1 trillion yen, and that's just for one product. Okay, so there's obviously going to be some issues about the costs. It's an investment, as Aiko said. This is not about a cost that you spend on something. It's not consumption. It's an investment in the future. But how much? Where are we going to get the money, at least to finance this? Will it come from the Bank of Japan just printing money? Will we have to raise taxes on somebody? If so, on whom and how much? Or will we be able to cut other elements of government spending? Right now, total government spending in Japan is about 200 trillion yen at all levels of government. About 2/3 of that, 130, 40 trillion or so, is on social welfare spending, pensions, medical, welfare, etc. Okay, so if we're going to fund all these wonderful new investments, and they are great investments in new infrastructure, human capital, are we going to do it by printing money, by raising taxes, or by cutting spending elsewhere? That's a hard question. So if I may, let me put Ken on the spot on that, and then ask Aiko if she could have any observations from the US perspective, because the US has exactly the same problem.
Right. So you give me the easy question first, right?
Right. That's the easy one. Yeah.
Well, who pays for it? The current system of capitalism, nobody pays for it. Just borrow the money, right? And people say it's not a problem. The government will never go under. I think it's a problem. because basically you're just borrowing from the next generation. The new form of capitalism is saying we want to invest in people, right? So one people that we need to be investing in is the future generation of Japan and the world. And guess what? In the in the democratic system, they have no voice because they're not born yet. And so we just stuff the the debt to them, and we assume that they can stuff the debt to the further generation, and we'll just go on with our happy lives. I think that's a problem. And so as you mentioned, something needs to be done, but where does then what do you do? Well, I mentioned at the opening that we need innovation in measurement. I think this measurement, it's not just for the corporate sector, but I think it's important for the government sector, because the government sector, what's their measurement? It's the size of the budget, right? That's the input. There's no measurement for outcome. There might be a little bit of measurement for output, but for outcome, there's no measurement. So if there's this innovation and measurement of economic impact, environmental impact and social impact, it could become, it's a moonshot kind of an idea, but it'll be a common language between the private sector and the public sector. And if you have a common language, you can have this real, private sector, public sector partnership. And so I think the new form of capitalism, we haven't gotten into that kind of detail yet in the discussions, but when we're looking at the non-financial measurement of corporate performance, I think we need to have a new measurement of performance, is what I guess what I'm trying to say. We just relied always on the financial measurement for performance for competition in the market. If you could come up with other kinds of measurements, innovations, that can measure their performance. Well, I mean, we might be able to find a way so that we can streamline where because you want. I mean, as tax, I pay taxes. You pay taxes here.
Yeah, we do. Yes, we do.
And yeah, we'll pay our taxes, but hopefully it'll have outcome that makes sense to us.
You've actually raised a very, very deep issue, which is an issue of accounting And I think the government has already formed some little committees, including Kunio Ito, who's a huge accounting professor. And these committees are supposed to talk about and come up with ideas. Kishida tasked them with coming up with ideas about disclosure of non-financial assets. For example, what is the human capital in your company? Okay, what is your carbon footprint? Things like that. If we have better disclosure of those things, will we be able to measure the output of government policies better?
Well, I mean, that's where we should be heading, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you measure? You just not to increase the burden on the company or burden on the person measuring, but hopefully that that we're actually measuring for the outcome of the performance, and whether it's a company budget or a public budget, especially. We should be able to measure it. And it's not easy because obviously all the government branches office, they have their budget and they're very protective of their budget. They don't want to be reallocated. It's not easy. It's not easy. But but if you could come up with a measurement that says this is the outcome, okay, well then we need to reallocate. So we need to see where the gap is, basically the gap between the outcome and the input.
Very good. Aiko, can I go to you for a comment on this?
Sure. As Shibusawa-san was speaking, I was thinking about this topic of wage increases, and you asked who pays for this, and I hope somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought I read somewhere that the in terms of the policy regarding wage increases so far, that is focused more on the public sector right now with for healthcare workers and educational specialists and so forth. My understanding is that some of the wage increase is actually being borne by the consumer. So I guess, we've obviously had a debate here in the United States regarding minimum wage across various states and so forth. And, the chamber's position is just that, a strong and growing economy is the best way to increase wages. There really needs to be a thoughtful approach to minimum wage or just any wage increase based on economic data and market conditions. And so arbitrary wage increase can actually, trigger inflation and raise costs for consumers and sometimes make it harder for, first-time job seekers or others to find employment. So I think it really needs to be done in a careful and very thoughtful way. And so I know that, Keidanren has come out and I think there's some views from the Japanese business community on this as well. I think it's still relatively unknown what the impact is going to be on US business or foreign companies, but I think that's one area that we'll also be watching.
Very good, which sort of brings up the issue of basic income, but that would open a very large can of worms. Noah, do you have any comments on this point?
Well, I would just say that, I think we do have somewhat of an answer, at least in the short term, which is that the government is going to continue paying for this through fiscal stimulus. It was the first thing that the new Kishida administration did when they came to office, a big new stimulus package. There are, of course, I think Japan's experience has shown that, what we thought to be the limits of fiscal limits or debt limits aren't what we once thought them to be, and there are, of course, different opinions on how far and how long those limits can be pushed. But at least in the short term, it seems like the Japanese government is going to continue pushing them. That said, I think the question is what you spend on. The ability to borrow and to spend is not a license to borrow and spend unwisely, and I think there has been a lot of concern amongst economists I talked to here in Tokyo that especially during the pandemic, a lot of the stimulus has gone basically to supporting businesses that weren't very healthy to begin with, or to households that end up saving rather than spending the stimulus. So, if the stimulus if the money is being spent on things that raise the long-term growth potential of the economy, that's one thing. If not, it's an entirely different matter.
That's actually also a very deep and important observation, I think. If you look at Kishida's essay, he does actually have some targets for R&D spending. increased targets for R&D spending. My question is it enough? What we do know from the Japanese government budget data is that overall spending on R&D by the government has been, in nominal terms, flat for about 20 some years. We also know that spending on education has been flat for about 20 years. Well, spending on healthcare has been going straight up, spending on pensions has been going straight up. So what we have here is a government that's spending, that is borrowing money for consumption instead of borrowing money for investment. And I think that's another way to look at new capitalism, or Kishida's plan. And he does talk about spending money on those new good things, but he doesn't talk much about the reduction of some of the consumption items that the government is making. And I think that's a perfectly understandable position, because we have an election coming up this summer, which brings up the issue of market failures versus government failures. So we talk about corporate governance, but then we have some issues of national governments. Now, as an American, I have some hesitancy about bringing up the government failures of countries other than my own. But nevertheless, they do exist elsewhere, including in Japan. So I'm wondering what our panelists think some of the key government failures, that is, how can the governance of Japan be improved in a way that gets us a little closer to that new capitalism? Ken?
Why do you always pick me for the easy ones first?
Yeah, well,
well, we can talk about this all night long, in a sense, because the governance of the, well, we don't get to elect our national leader.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we elect the lower house, the politicians, and they do their thing, and so it's not direct, democracy in that respect. If you look at the other parts of it, and well, I don't want to go down that road, because it's just lots of details that I think it's that I would take too much time. But one part of the governance that I worry about is actually the BOJ. And in the central bank is a very important institution for any thriving economy. That's for sure. And the BOJ has done a very good job in terms of providing liquidity to the market since 2012, 14, back in those days. But we kind of went down a road. We crossed that, what's it called, the Rubicon, and they started buying assets that were non-traditional. The most non-traditional being equity.
Yes.
If you're in a financial crisis, yeah, I mean, as a buyer of last resort, they can come in. But as a normal way of providing liquidity to the markets, to stimulate the premium, I guess I call it equity premium, whatever that means actually. And now, guess what? Our biggest shareholder for Japanese corporations used to be the GPIF, but now it's indirectly the Bank of Japan. And who was behind that governance of doing that? And the Japanese government did a very good job in terms of incorporating in corporate governance code. And GPIF was very, very instrumental in that implementation as well. Well, the BOJ, because they hold ETFs, and they say, well, and they're also the government, right? Actually, government institutions, and GPIF is the pensions for us. So that's actually, it's not the government in a sense, right? It's kind of going backwards, right? Because like the BOJ can't really enforce governance directly on the corporations, and if they do, then they're the government, right?
Yes.
And so that doesn't problem. There's a problem with that. The biggest problem is there. I think currently it's about 50 trillion yen mark to market. I think it might be a little bit low because the market's a little bit lower, but and if you look at the BOJ as a regular company, which they're not, I know, but their capital is 4.4 trillion. So for a risk asset, they're leveraged 12 times. I used to work at a hedge fund. No hedge fund will leverage equity 12 times without hedging. It's outrageous, right? And what happens if the market tanks? If there's another long tail risk crisis, which happens every 10 years or so?
Mhm.
Well,
Mhm.
the central bank of Japan is in a problem, right? Because they have at least on paper they'll have
Mhm.
significant losses.
Mhm.
And of course, they're the government, so they're not going to go under.
Mhm.
But they're also the caretaker for the currency of
Yes.
Japan.
Mhm.
Well, what do you think how do you think the market will react?
Mhm.
So there's a scenario. It's a long tail scenario risk,
Mhm.
but we could have really a sharp sell off of the yen,
Mhm.
right? Just the yen losing credibility in the markets,
Mhm.
which is Aiko talked about inflation. This is really, it's going to be really nasty inflation because the wages aren't going up in a hurry.
Mhm. So we have to do something with those equities. I think in your presentations to the New Capitalism Committee, you made one of the most interesting and forward-looking proposals on that, which is that the Bank of Japan take those equities that it has, convert them into an education funding fund. Okay, so take the dividends, et cetera, from those very large equity holdings and use them to help retraining in the economy. Can you comment a little bit about this proposal and how it was perceived as an element of new capitalism?
Sure. Well, the idea was not actually, it was my friend's idea. So I was just using my friend's idea to because I thought it was also a very interesting idea. And his idea was to take the ETF, which is a financial instrument, but you convert it into physical equity.
Into stock, yeah.
Stock, right? Well, stock will have dividends, right? So with about 50 trillion yen of equity, you'll probably have about almost, a sizable 700 billion or so of, more maybe of annual money coming in.
Yeah.
Well, then you can then we talked about investing in the people. Well, one of the people that we need to be investing in new form of capitalism is obviously the next generation, right? So why don't we use that money to invest in the future generation in education? We launched a Daigaku Fundo, a university fund, but it's funded by fiscal borrowing, which 60 years borrowing, that's way down the road. It's almost like it's almost like real cash, I guess, but it's still borrowing, right? But having this money to come in for investing into future of Japan, future generation, and also R&D, I think that would make sense. So it's just an idea I floated in the discussion. We'll see where it goes.
So we'll know what to do with those dividends that the BOJ gets in.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit late in moving into the Q&A session, but we do have a number of very interesting questions. So let me see if I can use the rest of our time to do that. One question really has to do with how, call it new capitalism, impacts the US-China rivalry in the region, okay? And as I mentioned before, Prime Minister Kishida has said that new capitalism is one of the ways that we can make a democracy plus capitalism a more attractive system than, call it authoritarian plus state capitalism. So with Aiko-san, with your background in, call it security policy, can you talk a little bit about how new capitalism might impact the great power rivalry in the world?
Well, thanks, Robert, and thanks for that question. I think it's a little bit difficult to see how new capitalism fits into, the broader strategy for the Indo-Pacific region, except for what I mentioned earlier on the energy transition issues. And I guess I would just say, looking at the question regarding how Japan fits within U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific region, I think, as somebody who worked in U.S. government for a very long time and worked with the Japanese government for many, many years, I think there's been a real transition, a real shift. Before, it was a lot more, the partnership and the alliance with the U.S. Between the U.S. and Japan was much more focused on doing things together And today in 2022, it's much more focused on the US and Japan working together, but to influence the region and the world. And Japan has really become a true leader in this regard. And so I think that's the one shift that Japan alliance managers, so to speak, in the US have really seen in terms of its alliance and partnership with Japan. So in terms of how that fits in with new capitalism, I think it will come to fruition mostly in the economic security policy and also in energy security, energy transition. Those are the two policies that come to mind where this new capitalism, strategy, fits in.
Okay, thanks very much. And since we've talked a little bit about trade issues here, we have one question about how the CPTPP and other trade agreements RCEP are related to this new capitalism agenda, particularly migration, guest workers, tourism, but also Japan opening doors more once COVID settles, obviously, to entrepreneurs from around the world. I mean, obviously, getting CPTPP done was one of Prime Minister Abe's great accomplishments, and I think I certainly feel very indebted to him for pushing and making that happen. So that's a wonderful thing. But how do we see trade agreements contributing to the new capitalism going forward? Noah, could I ask your perspective on that?
Sure, my turn to get a
hard question.
Fun ones. I think I see very little on trade in the context of new capitalism, and even less. On immigration and foreign workers. I mean, it's no news to anyone on this webinar or anyone listening to this webinar that Japan's borders have been closed, and it's been now 2 years since students, guest workers, business people have been able to get into the country. We hear whispers that now might be the time that they're going to relax. It might be this week, it might be the week after, but every time there's a new uptick in cases or a new poll showing that voters like strict COVID policies, that talk seems to die down. So I think it's a big question mark for new capitalism. What is Japan's relationship to the outside world? To what extent is this just a temporary COVID-induced isolationist period, and to what extent does this actually signal a turn away from a more proactive and a more integrated relationship with the rest of the world? As I was working on the piece you mentioned earlier, Robbie, I talked to a lot of people across Japan, local leaders, about immigration in particular, and I was really struck by the openness amongst local government officials, governors, mayors, and business leaders in Japan, the appetite for a real discussion about immigration policy, about foreign workers going forward. I think there's an appetite for it, and I hope that is part of the discussion in new capitalism going forward.
Okay, thanks very much. I should mention that question about migration and tourism came from Adam Posen, who is a great economist and has been following Japan for at least 30 years that I've been involved in the financial market. So Adam, thanks very much for that question. I want to move on now. I think we might have time only for one more question, but this is a question from Ryuichiro Iwanami, who is asking about the Freelance Protection Act. This is a very important question. We've mentioned the importance of labor market reforms, but one of the characteristics of Japanese labor markets for many years has been this dual labor market. The average wage at large firms is about 60% higher than the average wage at smaller firms. And it's hard for me to believe that large firms are 60% more productive than small ones. Yes, they have more capital, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're that much more productive. So we have this dual labor market, and we have very poor protection for people who are not in the standard labor sort of labor market. Okay, so as part of new capitalism, are we going to see a labor market that is more vibrant, particularly, as Aiko mentioned before, one that has standards, fair standards for termination, because now there aren't any. People who are fired from small firms typically will get a very small settlement. People who are fired from large firms get a very large settlement, which is why the big firms don't want to fire people. So what are we going to see in labor markets to allow us to transfer people from old jobs to new jobs a little more, call it flexibly? Ken, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you this hard one too.
Now, this has come up in the discussions, and I think this is a very critical part of new form of capitalism. When you talk about human capital and trying to raise wages, unless you have increased in liquidity of the labor market, you're not going to be able to increase wages. Corporations, like say, you can't lay off people. So if you can't lay off people on the permanent staff, well, guess what? They'll hire part-time at a lower price or lower wages. And so I think what we need to say is, like at the initial opening remarks, I talked about the Showa period. It's time to get rid of that. You get rid of the lifetime employment, the seniority system, and the the hiring of freshmen straight out of college in what we call ikatsusayo. Unless we can get rid of that model that worked perfectly in that era to this new era, I think Japan will continue to lose its competitive edge. Wages won't go up. In the end, nobody's happy. And so I think if one thing that comes out of the new form of capitalism, I hope that there would be a lot of labor reform, which is not obviously an easy thing.
Noah, can I go back to you and ask, in your reporting around Japan, what do people tell you about labor markets and labor reform and where they want to see the labor market going? How does that fit into the new capitalism agenda?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think there are, on the one hand, you have a clear generational change happening. I mean, the post-Showa eras, the children of the post-Showa eras certainly have different ideas about the kinds of relationships they'd like to enter into with employers, the kinds of jobs they'd like to have, and so there's clearly demand for this, I think, from the bottom up, but it's tempered. It's tempered, I would say, by fear of the future. I mean, by a real sense that, as Ken mentioned, that futures are being mortgaged. Tomorrow's futures are being mortgaged today, and so. The preference for stability is still very strong. I think if you're talking about wages, for example, the behavior of Japanese unions is telling. There is some talk this year about pushing for higher wages, but I was speaking with Yoshino-san of Rengo the other week, and there there's clearly the traditional model still clearly has a lot of appeal for a lot of people across Japan. So I think there has to be a kind of a transition period. That's the way most people I've talked to see it. You can't swing wildly from one system to the next.
Yeah, I've discovered that in my discussions with my students at Tokyo University of Science and the program I teach there, this is a mid-career program. They're basically in their mid-40s. And what they're discovering is that once you get into your 40s, there's a discount. If you want to quit your firm and move somewhere else, you're regarded as someone who has been in this lifetime employment system, and you're not that attractive anymore. So I think young people are beginning to understand that, but it's very difficult for people who are already in that situation to say, okay, I got to do something. The other thing I think about the system is that because it's so difficult to move jobs, it reduces the incentive to acquire new skills. And to me, that is just very bad for improving resource allocation, but also for technology development. So that's one area that I'm going to be looking for in the new capitalism, to see if the new program comes up with, call it better ways to make labor markets more liquid and more fair to workers, whether you're a regular worker or non-regular worker.
The other thing I would just add, Robbie, sorry, one other thought is that we haven't talked much about this, and I think it's important to bring up, and it's something that comes up especially in regions outside Tokyo where the demographic transition has moved further, is thinking about what role there is for the elderly in the labor market of the future. You know, what kinds of jobs, what kinds of roles folks in their 60s and their 70s, maybe even their 80s can be playing. And I think that has to be a part of the picture of new capitalism as well.
Definitely, which is clearly related to the issue of retirement age. Now, right now, if you look at the age at which people have 15 years left to live, it's in the mid 70s. So why do people retire at 65? It's a very, very difficult question, which also brings up reskilling and things like that. So thanks for bringing that up. It's a clear element, and it also relates very closely to these issues of the new capitalism. In fact, Minister Yamagiwa was on did an event the other day where he actually mentioned 75 as a potential retirement age. So that's another thing I think we'll be looking for. Okay, we're getting to the end of our time.
I'm sorry, I think that's really bad because I mean, I'm sorry, to make it clear, for large corporations and the government to extend the retirement is really bad, I think, because it really decreases the metabolism for smaller companies and other companies, but for the large companies, if they extend the retirement age, we'll see further decline of Japan Inc.
I'm actually saying something a little closer to what Ninami-san thought, which is have a retirement age of 40 or 45.
I've been saying that for like 10 years.
Me too. Yeah, me too, actually. So that basically, it's just a more fluid labor market. But the time that you leave the labor force and start collecting your pension would start at 75, regardless of where you work. Okay. So that gets us into a lot of technical difficulties, but basically people have to work longer. So Noah, thanks for pointing that out, and Ken, thanks for that comment as well. We're getting very close to the end. So now, if I may, since we've had comments now from both Noah and Ken, Aiko, do you have a final comment for us?
Yeah, no, I'm, just with regards to the labor market, workforce flexibility, I would just, add that you mentioned skilled and unskilled immigrant labor, but also mid-career professionals moving from between companies, which is really important, but also young professionals entering the market. And I think it's important for them to be able to achieve career advancement earlier on, rather than waiting for decades to receive a little bit more seniority, especially where, in terms of rewarding talent. And then the other thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, but just with regards to women in the workforce, I think it needs to be a lot easier for women to enter and leave the workforce when they want, but also not have it be not have it sacrifice their ability to achieve positions of leadership. So that's all I would just add. And I do hope to see some more of this in Prime Minister Kishida's new capitalism strategy.
Yes, he's definitely mentioned that in the Bunge Shinju article, but we need it in a little, as you say, in a little more concrete form. Okay, let me thank our panelists for joining us tonight. We had a very broad-ranging discussion. New capitalism is obviously a hydra of many, many things that have to be put together and fit together well. So let me thank you for this very lively discussion. This is the last of the six series parts of the sixth series, but we'll be back in May. There will be a new series of Asia Undercurrent seminars. And so please join us in May when we restart those. And there are archives of the early ones if you haven't seen them. So please refer to those at the website. And finally, you have also received a link to a survey for this session. So if you could do us the favor of filling out that survey, we'd be very, very grateful. So let me thank our sponsors, again, the government of Japan and the Nikkei for this. Let me thank our panelists for joining us. And let me thank our audience for taking time out of their schedules to join us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.